Haas V F20. This one was never built to win races. It'll forever be remembered for one of the most terrifying crashes in modern F1. November 29th, 2020, Bahrain Grand Prix. Romain Grosjean clipped Daniil Kvyat's AlphaTauri on the opening lap and speared straight into a steel barrier at 137 miles per hour. The car split in two on impact, the fuel tank ruptured, and a fireball erupted instantly. For 28 seconds, it looked like the unthinkable. But then Grosjean climbed out through flames with only burns on his hands. The reason? The VF20 was designed to break apart like a paper toy. The rear detached, the nose cone shattered, and even the front suspension disintegrated. All of that violent destruction spread the crash energy away from the cockpit. The one piece that stayed intact was the carbon fiber survival cell, the driver's capsule, combined with the halo above his head. The FIA's philosophy worked exactly as intended. A multi-million-dollar car sacrificed itself in exchange for the driver's life. BMW Sauber F107. June 10th, 2007. Canadian Grand Prix. Robert Kubica's BMW Sauber F1.07 was about to give the world a crash test demonstration. No engineer would ever plan, but every engineer needed to see. On lap 27, running nearly 186 miles per hour, Kubica clipped Jarno Trulli's Toyota, launched into the wall, and skidded across the track in a sickening series of flips. The car exploded into pieces, front wing gone, wheels ripped off, suspension arms shattered like toothpicks. By the time it came to a halt, the F1.07 looked less like a race car and more like a scrapyard. And yet, through all that violence, the carbon fiber monocoque stayed intact. Kubica's legs were pinned, but his survival cell held firm. He escaped with only a sprained ankle and a concussion. That moment became the perfect case study in why modern F1 cars are designed to break apart. Every piece that flew off bled energy away from the driver's body. The detachable nose, the snapping wheels, the shattered suspension. It all worked like a giant shock absorber. Instead of carrying the full force, the car sacrificed itself one part at a time. Ferrari 312 T2. By the mid-1970s, Formula One had a serious problem. Cars were fast, but when they crashed, they stayed solid. And that meant the driver absorbed everything. The Ferrari 312 T2 came in during 1976. The first season, the FIA forced teams to add deformable crash structures. For the first time, nosecones and side pods weren't meant to be indestructible. They were designed to crumple like soda cans and bleed energy away from the cockpit. The 312 T2 became Ferrari's weapon under these new rules. It kept the same flat 12 engine and innovative transverse gearbox that made the original 312T a winner, but now the chassis had built-in weak zones. In practice, that meant a frontal hit would crush the nose, and side impacts would deform the bodywork before force reached the driver. This was the era of Niki Lauda, and the car's story was forever tied to his horrific accident at the Nürburgring in '76. Lauda's crash came from a suspension failure and fire, not the deformable structure itself. But it highlighted exactly why the FIA had pushed for cars that would break apart under pressure. Williams FW36. The 2014 season wasn't just about hybrid engines. It also introduced one of the strangest regulation changes in F1 history, the mandatory low nose. The FIA wanted safer cars that wouldn't launch into the air during collisions, so every team had to redesign the front of their chassis. For Williams, that meant the FW36, a car with speed in a straight line, but a nose so fragile it looked like it belonged on a toy. Crash tests forced the tip of the nose to sit extremely low, with a thin structure leading into the rest of the chassis. The design passed regulations, but in racing conditions, it broke off under the lightest contact. Fans saw nose cones snapping clean in first lap battles and carbon fibre scattered across the track. The FW36 wasn't alone in this. The entire grid was experimenting with awkward anteater designs. but Williams became one of the most visible examples of regulation-driven fragility. Ironically, the FW36 performed well that year. Mercedes' power made it a rocket on the straights, and Felipe Massa even put it on pole in Austria. Still, every small collision risked turning the car into spare parts. McLaren MP 4/4. It's remembered as the most dominant Formula One car ever built. 15 wins out of 16 races in 1988, with Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost running the show. What gets overlooked is how fragile this monster really was. Gordon Murray's design philosophy stripped everything down for performance. The Honda V6 Turbo was packed inside an ultra-low chassis, with suspension arms and gearbox parts so light they were practically disposable. The MP 4/4 wasn't engineered to last a season. It was engineered to last a race weekend. Components were pushed to their absolute limit, and the team accepted that parts would wear out or snap if pushed any further. Reliability came second to outright speed, and McLaren banked on swapping out fragile pieces before they failed. It was a gamble that worked. The car was untouchable when it held together. Senna and Prost both had their share of mechanical gremlins, clutch issues, gearbox concerns, and occasional failures. But the overall package was so fast that even fragility couldn't derail the campaign. When it crossed the line, the MP 4/4 was unstoppable. When it broke because that's exactly what it had been built to do. Run on the edge, then collapse once its job was finished. Toro Rosso STR3. This one is best remembered for one moment. Monza 2008, when a 21-year-old Sebastian Vettel scored his first ever Formula One win. A midfield car beating the giants in the rain was already wild, but what made the STR3 stand out was how fragile it was everywhere else. The car's suspension was notoriously delicate. Its carbon fibre wishbones were designed to shear off cleanly in collisions, and that meant a minor nudge could leave it stranded with 3 wheels instead of 4. That fragility was part of the safety philosophy across the grid. Suspension arms were never supposed to hold up under big impacts. They acted like fuses, snapping away so the energy wouldn't travel back into the survival cell. In races, though, this meant the STR3 regularly littered circuits with broken pieces whenever the midfield got too tight. Ironically, the same machine that spent half the season looking like spare parts produced one of the greatest underdog stories in modern F1. Vettel kept it on track in treacherous conditions, while faster cars spun off or broke down. For a chassis built to fall apart under pressure, that day it stayed together just long enough to make history. The STR3 showed how a car could be both fragile and legendary at the same time. Its suspension was built to snap, yet it gave birth to the career of a 4-time world champion, Mercedes W11. Often called the most advanced Formula One car ever made, Mercedes W11 won 13 races, carried Lewis Hamilton to his 7th world title, and introduced the DAS system that let drivers adjust toe angles on the straights. But underneath the brilliance was a design feature shared by every modern car: suspension built to brake. In 2020, FIA crash standards required that suspension arms act like sacrificial parts. When a car hit the wall, the carbon fibre wishbones weren't supposed to hold. They were engineered to shear off instantly, keeping the survival cell from taking the full impact. On the W11, those arms were razor-thin, tuned for both weight-saving and controlled collapse. The Nürburgring that year gave fans a reminder. Valtteri Bottas ran wide and damaged his suspension, forcing him to retire. To the untrained eye, it looked like a failure. In reality, that failure was the system doing its job, preventing stress from travelling back into the tub where the driver sat. It was the same story any time a W11 tangled wheels or clipped barriers. The suspension snapped, the car sank to the ground, and the driver walked away. McLaren MP 418. The car was hyped as the future of the sport, designed by Adrian Newey with an ultra-low chassis, compact packaging, and radical aerodynamics. On paper, it was supposed to blow the competition away. In reality, the car broke so often in testing that it never made a single Grand Prix start. From the first shakedowns, problems piled up. Cooling issues plagued the car, with the tightly packaged bodywork starving the engine of airflow. The suspension couldn't cope with the loads. Arms snapped, components buckled, and test crashes ended in wreckage more than data. Safety concerns grew so severe that the FIA hesitated to even approve it for racing. Meanwhile, McLaren had to stick with the older MP417D, which was solid but not revolutionary. The MP418 became a money-burning project, months of work that delivered nothing except a cautionary tale. Engineers admitted later that the design had pushed too far, too fast. Still, the car left a footprint. Many of its experimental concepts influenced the eventual MP4-19 and beyond. The MP418's fragility proved that in Formula One, chasing the absolute edge can turn an engineering dream into a disaster. Ferrari SF90. This one was a car built for speed. It had one of the strongest engines on the grid in 2019, often the quickest down the straights, and it gave Charles Leclerc his first F1 wins. But hidden under all that power was a weak spot: the gearbox. Ferrari trimmed it for weight, designed it to be as compact as possible, and in doing so turned it into one of the most fragile components of the entire package. Throughout the season, reliability became a recurring headache. Grid penalties stacked up when gearboxes needed swapping before they reached their mandated mileage. Mechanics were constantly on edge, knowing that even minor contact could ripple through and ruin the casing. At tracks like Monza and Spa, Ferrari's engine gave them a clear edge, but the gearbox was always one shift away from disaster. The philosophy behind it was classic Formula One trade-off. Every gram saved meant a fraction of a second gained over a lap. In a sport where margins are microscopic, Ferrari gambled on fragility. Sometimes it paid off, delivering victories. Other times, it left the team scratching their heads as another gearbox change pushed them down the grid. Alfa Romeo C39. This one was never a front-runner. It spent most of 2020 fighting in the back half of the grid, often battling just to get out of Q1. But what stood out about the car was how easily it came apart in wheel-to-wheel combat. Even the slightest contact could snap suspension arms or damage the rear structure, leaving the C39 limping back to the pits or parked on the side of the track. That fragility wasn't poor workmanship. It was the direct result of FIA crash rules. The suspension and gearbox casing on modern F1 cars are built to shear away under stress, sparing the carbon fibre survival cell. Alfa's design leaned heavily into this philosophy. During collisions, the rear end broke off cleanly, and suspension pieces scattered across the circuit, exactly as intended. To fans, it looked like the car couldn't take a hit. To engineers, it meant the safety systems were doing their job. On track, this meant drivers like Kimi Raikkonen and Antonio Giovinazzi were constantly at risk of race-ending damage from the smallest bump. But for the FIA, the C39 was proof of concept. When something had to break, it was always the car, never the driver's body. And that's it. So now to you, if the sport keeps chasing speed by building cars that are meant to break, what happens when engineers finally reach the limit? A car so fragile, it only survives until the checkered flag? Comment down below, leave a like, and subscribe for more amazing videos like this one.